Now, they're two of the world's most powerful leaders, but relations between their countries have turned markedly frosty. Germany's Angela Merkel strongly backed European Union sanctions against Moscow, while Russia's Vladimir Putin imposed a ban on many Western European agricultural products. But now they're aiming to resolve their differences as the German Chancellor heads to Russia for the first time in 2 years. So what are the chances of a breakthrough? The BBC's Steve Rosenberg is in Moscow and Damien McGuinness is in Berlin. Damien, I'm going to come to you first. We've got Ukraine and EU sanctions and Syria. Is there really any hope there in Germany of a breakthrough?
Well, I don't think anyone in Berlin is expecting a breakthrough anytime soon. But of course, for Germany, dialogue and keeping dialogue going is incredibly important. Originally, in fact, Mrs. Merkel had decided not to go to Russia until a ceasefire had been implemented in Ukraine. She hasn't been to Russia for 2 years. But the situation internationally, of course, has now changed because we have Donald Trump in the White House. And to a certain extent, I think Mrs. Merkel wants to meet Mr. Putin face-to-face again to find out what he thinks about Donald Trump and how that changes the situation in Syria. And of course, when it comes to Ukraine, Berlin is still adamant that until there's a ceasefire, Berlin can't change its position that the annexation of Crimea is illegal and that Berlin still is accusing Russia of meddling in eastern Ukraine. That's not going to change. But what Mrs. Merkel is trying to do is to keep talking to Mr. Putin. And there is an expectation here that if Mr. Putin shows any sign of compromise or willingness to work with the West, then the German Chancellor will certainly do her best to build a bridge towards Moscow, because from Berlin's perspective, the only way of solving the conflicts in Ukraine and Syria is really with Moscow's help.
OK, Steve, let me take that to you in Moscow. Damien mentioned the word compromise there. Does that sound like something Vladimir Putin is likely to do on these particular topics?
I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, Vladimir Putin recently did call for the full normalization of relations between Russia and Germany. But, you know, they say opposites attract. But in this case, I think I don't see that, because from all we know about the Putin-Merkel relationship, there is no love lost between these two leaders, despite the fact that they have some things in common. He speaks her language, she speaks his. Vladimir Putin speaks fluent German from his time as a KGB officer in East Germany, and Angela Merkel speaks fluent Russian because she grew up in East Germany and learned it at school. Also, both leaders have been in power for a long time. Vladimir Putin, 17 years as president and prime minister, and Angela Merkel coming up to 12 years. But their worldviews are so different. Angela Merkel sees herself as the defender of Western liberal ideas, Western democracy, civil society, the European Union. Vladimir Putin is an authoritarian leader who appears to be doing all he can to undermine Western liberal ideas and Western institutions. And following from that, they have great differences on all these issues which we've already mentioned, so Ukraine and Syria, and also the future of Europe. So I think it's going to be difficult. And some of the Russian papers this morning are playing down the meeting, saying it's unlikely there's going to be a breakthrough this time round.
Steve, Germany, Angela Merkel really pushed the sanctions, the EU sanctions against Russia. Does that give much leverage with Vladimir Putin? Would he like to see those eased? Are they biting in Russia?
Well, you don't see them biting in the shops, really. People don't talk about the sanctions too much. I'm sure that Vladimir Putin would like the sanctions removed. And there was some suggestion, again, in the Russian papers today that German officials have come to a conclusion that the sanctions are not working. The sanctions haven't actually persuaded Moscow to change its position on Ukraine or the annexation of Crimea. But I don't think we're going to see a removal of sanctions anytime soon. What is clear is that Russia has been making efforts to weaken unity over sanctions within the European Union. Certainly the Russians would like to see the EU reverse the sanctions and actually scrap them.
OK, Steve, in Moscow, thank you very much. Let's just go back to Damien in Berlin for one. Damien, in terms of public opinion in Germany, does Angela Merkel have much room really to differ her negotiating stance?
Well, I think what's changed here in Germany is the perception from abroad about how strong Angela Merkel is now domestically. So if you look at the position, say, a year ago, there was a hope in Russia that Angela Merkel was actually weakened and wouldn't really stand a chance of winning the next elections in September. That's now changed because anti-EU populists, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party, they're quite weak right now. And Mrs. Merkel is still way ahead of her left-wing rival for the position of Chancellor. So Mr. Putin's clearly aware that Mrs. Merkel is someone he's going to have to most likely keep dealing with the next couple of years. So that makes her more interesting and more powerful for him. And as far as sanctions go here in Germany, although there is always pressure from certain business leaders and from some politicians here to ease sanctions against Russia, there is still an astonishing amount of unity between the government and German business to keep sanctions going, because Mrs. Merkel has managed to persuade business leaders that sanctions are in their interest long term, and Berlin is still convinced that's the only way to go. So I don't think really there's any chance of sanctions being lifted anytime soon.
Gentlemen, thank you both for your analysis. Damien McGuinness in Berlin and Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. Thank you very much. Let's take